Get started in a moment here. Did you carry on the mic?
I do. I don't know. All right, well, folks, we'll get started if we can. We have your attention.
I'm not sure this is working.
Great. Are we all set? Okay. Thank you. Delighted to. Good. I think we're all live. And I hope folks who are joining us virtually can hear us too. My name is John Kucich, and I am very excited to introduce these two wonderful researchers, writers, and scholars. I'm sure that many of us here have dated a new era in our lives from the reading of one of their books, and that there are many truly fortunate ones among us who have benefited from their generosity as colleagues and friends. In their expansive accounts of the Transcendentalist world, they've never forgotten that books and essays and poems are written by real people going about their lives, turning the everyday concerns of getting a living and living with principle into art that speaks to the ages. We are fortunate indeed in having the chance to speak with them. This plenary session will be in two parts. For the first 45 minutes, Professors Gross and Marshall will have a conversation with each other about the different emphases and insights of their work and the many intersections between them. After that, we'll open the conversation to members of the audience here in the room and joining us over the internet. We look forward to your questions. Robert Gross is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Professor of Early American History Emeritus at the University of Connecticut. He's the author of The Minutemen and Their World, which won the Bancroft Prize, and of Books and Libraries and Thoreau's Concord. With Mary Kelly, he's the co-editor of An Extensive Republic, Print, Culture, and Society in the New Nation, 1790 to 1840. A former assistant editor at Newsweek, he's written for such periodicals as Esquire, Harper's, the Boston Globe, and New York Times, and his essays have appeared in the American Scholar, the New England Quarterly, Raritan, and the Yale Review. His most recent book is The Transcendentalists and Their World from 2021, a work that was some 40 years in the making and completely worth the wait. Megan Marshall is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, The Peabody Sisters, Three Women Who Ignited American Romanticism, and Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast. She's a past president of the Society of American Historians and the Charles Wesley Emerson College professor at Emerson College, where she teaches in the MFA Creative Writing program. She is co-editing with Bridget Bailey and Noel Baker the first and long overdue Library of America edition of Margaret Fuller's writings. We are privileged to be part of this conversation, and I'll let you folks take it from here. Thank you.
I'm going to move into the hot mic seat so you can hear me. Welcome to all of you and to the remote audience as well. We're speaking to all of you. I'm going to primarily be quizzing Bob, but he might have some questions for me too. So we'll see how that goes. You might notice I have his book here, and we'll probably look to you who can see it closely that I haven't read it, but I actually have. I read an early copy so that I could write a blurb for this wonderful book. And in my blurb, I said that Bob finally in this book definitively answers the perennial question, why Concord? Why was this intellectual flowering known as the American Renaissance, American Romanticism, and Transcendentalism? Why could it have begun nowhere else? So maybe we can start with Bob giving a quick answer to this big question that he spent a whole book answering.
Well, first, thanks to everybody for being here in this room that you can be thankful is not as hot right now as it will be in 2 days. And I also want to say that nothing gives me greater pleasure than to appear before the Thoreau Society for the very first time, not saying when my book's done or it's coming up. So why Concord? It took some 600 pages and a lot of decades to answer that question, but I'll give you a really simple answer. First, Emerson and Thoreau were deeply engaged with the town and drew on the life of their neighbors and the history of their community to inform their works and to shape their vision of transcendentalism. Secondly, why Concord? Emerson wanted to make his adopted town a center for intellectuals, a village that would recruit his friends from abroad, Thomas Carlyle, his friends in Massachusetts, Margaret Fuller, Bronson Alcott, all to be here, not in a commune, but close enough as neighbors to get together in his parlor for lively discussions. Why Concord? The third reason is that the town underwent a set of social and political, religious, and economic changes that were transformative and were representative of the same processes of change that were going on all over Massachusetts and New England and the North as a whole. And those changes created conditions about how to understand the world, for which inherited ideas and ideologies were insufficient, and to which Transcendentalism aimed to speak. And fourth, something I don't say in the book, but Robert Thorson suggested to me in an email recently, that if Concord was representative of many communities, then it still begs the question, what was unique about Concord? And what's unique about Concord, Thor rightly suggests, is that its geological history produced a natural world of hills that aren't mountains that are forbidding like Katahdin, of meadows and the sluggish rivers, in a natural world that could be amenable to the transcendentalist pastoral vision. And almost nowhere else in this region would you get a natural world, with Walden as well, the kettle pond left behind by the retreating glacier. Nowhere else would you get a natural world like Concord. So it may be that ultimately the answer to the question why Concord is people and nature.
Well, I'll take that. We'll take that. You know, I want to say also, I think this is maybe the first time I have spoken to an audience in person in 2 years or 3 years. I don't know, maybe you have, Bob, but it's startling, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And maybe some of you are feeling the same way, the first time you're in a group together, and what an excellent group to be part of. So thank you for being here, and thank you remote people too for being part of us. So we've talked, actually, I think Bob and I had maybe one of the first conversations by Zoom when his book came out in November, was it? And one of the things that we sort of rambled towards there was how astonishing it was, I guess, that Emerson and Thoreau stayed here. This was a time when so many people were leaving, particularly men with young families, or men who might want to start families, or men who were single. And maybe your answer, why Concord, sort of has something to do with why Emerson and Thoreau and many of the characters in this book stayed here. But, you know, what would have happened had Emerson gone west and Thoreau decided, you know, he'd set his cabin in Florida, something like that? Why didn't they?
And or open the country club.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think the larger point maybe to make here is that Concord, even though it was a town of just a couple thousand people, was incredibly fluid. Its native-born population, geographically mobile. Most of the sons could no longer inherit the farms from the previous generations. And so they're going to have to go somewhere, New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, then to the west, ultimately across to the Mississippi and beyond, or go to Boston or to Lowell, get jobs in commerce or in manufacturing. What was remarkable, I discovered, is that by certainly the era of the War of 1812, people were moving in and out of Concord at an incredibly rapid rate. So much so that by the 1835 bicentennial of Concord, only a third of the people at the celebration were natives of the town descended from first settlers. There was just an incredible turnover. For example, into stores in the center of town. There were 4 or 5 stores right in this town center. There were over a period of, say, 15, 20 years, maybe 40 people who kept those stores. I looked and found all their ads in the newspaper, and their opening ads were not, it didn't take too long to be followed by their closing ads. And what was fascinating about that is most of the storekeepers were young men, 21 years old, who'd open a store, be involved in it for a couple of years, and then have to close it. And you suddenly think to yourself, how'd they get the capital to open a store? You know, wouldn't you be stunned today if you found on Concord Square stores opened by 21-year-olds? Who, by our lights, you say, what, are you kidding? You know, you need a lot of time in Harvard Business School before you open that corner store. So there's incredible turnover, and Emerson is unusual among people from the Boston area who moved to Concord because he stayed. A lot of those people were moving. Likewise, young women were moving all over. Many, like Helen Thoreau and Cynthia for a time, to take teaching jobs in other towns or to go west. So what you have is a churning population and a relatively small number of people who are actually permanently here. And one of the problems for many of the elders of the community is, what do we do about all these rootless young men who are away from their families and on New Hampshire farms or in Boston and are now in Concord? Who's going to impose social control? And one of the things I trace in the book, I don't know if Megan wanted to get into this, but I've now wandered into it. But one of the things I trace in the book are the various ways in which Esther Ripley in the First Parish Church attempts to win the young and fails. The Masonic Lodge seeks out young men in their 20s aspiring to careers in trade or law or whatever, and they're passing through. But still, most young men don't join the Masons. And the Trinitarian Church, when it breaks with the First Parish, seeks to convert and born-again experiences young men, but it mostly gets young women. Transcendentalism becomes an attempt to speak to all those young men and young women who are uncertain about what they want to do in life, what their paths are going to be. They just know one thing: the world they want to enter repels them. And many of them, as Emerson will say in the essay, The Transcendentalists, hold back. They are reluctant to enter the fray. They prefer to be alone, to be in nature. It's clearly a portrait of Henry David Thoreau, but Thoreau as a figure of a larger generation.
Well, one of the great discoveries that underlies my Peabody Sisters book was a series of diaries that no one had known she kept. And in one of them, she's staying with Emerson just as he's, one of the first times she stays with him, 1837, I think it is. And she talks, he's still filling the supply, is preaching as a supply minister, and she rides with him off to maybe Lexington to give a sermon. And on that ride, on the ride home, he says, "Did you see those young men in the back? How they were shifting, they weren't paying attention. Those are the people I want to reach, and that's why I don't want to preach in a church anymore, because the church is not where they want to be either." So it was exciting to read that. Of course, I knew he kind of thought that, but it was exciting to have this conversation preserved and to see that he was confiding that in Elizabeth Peabody. So you mentioned the records of people coming in and out, and I can see this sort of glimmer in your eyes, these records. And I was thinking how much I enjoyed going through the Boston city directories, for example, and seeing all the different kinds of professions that women had, and at a time when Elizabeth Peabody moved in to take a teaching job. How were those listed? And can you talk a little bit about the pleasure you take in the granular, which is so much what this book is based in?
Sure. So the key to this is that a lot of social historians would ask the question, what was the history of Concord as a community? And that's important. But I wanted to answer a different question first, which is, who were the people of Concord? And to answer that question is to not write about a social structure or a township as a political entity or community as a social order, but to write about people and their lived experiences. So there are a lot of books you could read, which will tell you about the coming of capitalism or the impact of the railroad. But I wanted to tell about those changes through the actions of the people who, and experiences of the people who lived in the town. My notion has been throughout my writing of history, not just that I wanted to write history from the bottom up and the top down and the middle out and be as inclusive as possible. I wanted to write history in which I could place everyone I dealt with as figures for whom history is given to them. It's the larger structure of their lives. Nobody controls the world they're born into, and for the most part, all the forces that are happening around them. And yet, within those frameworks, people make choices. You know, think about Thoreau's central claim. You know, he went to the wood in order to live deliberately. And later he says, I want to live deliberately in opposition to people who lead lives of quiet desperation. To live deliberately is to make choices in your life, to make every act of your life a deliberate and considered choice. Whereas to be live in desperation is to resign yourself, to think there's no hope left, no choice left. So I wanted to write about the people of Concord as individuals and as members of family groups and the like. And so I did kind of enjoy the missing persons hunt, in which years ago I took a number of tax lists and the census lists, and I thought, I'm going to find out who all these people are. And I did it at a time when you were using printed genealogies and town records. And then I moved into the earliest familyhistory.org and then Ancestry and the like. And I got so, you know, you should hire me to find any of your lost relatives. You know, I could invade your privacy and I could surveil you as a historian better than anybody in the FBI you know. So there was a kind of pleasure. I mean, I have to admit, a little obsessive. But when you knew, you could actually find these people. And so another thing, let me ask you all this question. Does it ever bother you that when you read a history book, they'll quote somebody, they'll say, John Smith, a farmer from Kansas, said, and then there'll be a quote. And it's all you'll ever learn in the entire book about John Smith. You don't have to read John Smith. Trade it for William Williams or somebody else. The name is irrelevant to the quote. Yet lots of history books consist of quotes from random names who are rarely followed up.
And not, well, you know, that brings an interesting question. I'm full of questions here, but there's a wonderful aspect to your book, which is that it's kind of, I would say, a biographical work in a sense. We have a dual biography of Emerson and Thoreau, and there are many other characters in this book, but why didn't you want to just sort of say, I'm going to do a biography or a dual biography? I'm a biographer, so I want to know, do you have a beef with biography? Or does it not do something you want to do, or are you not capable of writing a biography after all this time?
Well, I don't know if I should offer my autobiography to the therapist to my right. I would say that I also wanted to write the history of the larger structure and the interplay between the individuals and their lived experience and then the decision makers and the larger story of the community. Because one of the central themes of the book is the deepening engagement of Concord and its deepening integration into the wider world. So one of the biggest changes from when I began the book in the late 1970s to now is that initially I was thinking of the community study not as an isolated Concord without connections to other places, but not as a Concord whose very deepening ties on the stages, then on the railroad, on through trade, through the sale of agricultural produce, through investments in corporations and banks. A Concord that is whose transformation involves its being ever more tightly bound up with larger forces coming especially from Boston. My story, for example, of the Concord church split reveals for the first time that the little band of secessionists from Ezra Ripley's congregation, led by Thoreau's three aunts, that little band was embedded by wealthy Orthodox Congregationalists from Park Street Church in Boston, who came in and said, "We understand you're unhappy with Ezra Ripley. You don't like Unitarians. We agree. We'd like to help you out. Can we help you get a minister? Can we recruit the minister for you? By the way, why don't you get a meeting house? We'll pay the mortgage." I also learned that when anti-Masonry became really important, one of the newspapers run by Herman Atwell lost all its support among the merchant class of the town and ended up being bought by anti-Masonic politicians in Middlesex County who never revealed their ownership. Both of those are stories that tell you that when you thought you were writing a small community study, you were actually writing this powerful account of the Boston area and the expansion of its politics to gather up all these other places. I mean, think about how today we often despair because so many down ballot elections are now polarized between the two national parties. We've nationalized our elections, and I would say in Massachusetts, we sectionalize, if you will, religious choices. We sectionalize politics, and crucially, we sectionalize and nationalize, or at least north, reform movements. When Concord people were signing petitions to the federal government and state government about issues involving slavery, getting rid of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. and the territories, for example, the very texts were written not in Concord, but by the American Anti-Slavery Society. They were printed up and assigned to each town's anti-slavery society to be taken around from door to door for signatures. The only thing local about those documents were the signatures.
So back to the split in the church, sitting where we are here as members of the Thoreau Society and probably kind of liberal spiritual types, it seems inevitable, this progression, and we've talked about how Emerson wanted to leave the church to reach the youth, and you know, Thoreau's aunts split off from the church, but Thoreau didn't. Was it inevitable in some way that the religious bent of Waldo and Henry was progressive, liberal, secularizing, or, you know, why didn't they try to accomplish the same thing by, you know, going evangelical?
Well, you might ask the divine spirit, which in the Calvinist version, it might visit you when you least expect, or might never visit you at all. How you feel about hell is another matter. But I don't think it was inevitable when the little band of dissidents withdrew from Ezra Ripley's congregation, which was not then the First Parish Church, because there was only one church. And so when the little group withdrew and formed its own congregation, it was actually known as the Second Congregational Society. At that time, in 1825, 26, about 85% of taxpayers were still paying for the liberal preaching of Ezra Ripley and his assistant, Barzillai Frost. It was only in 1834 that Massachusetts held a referendum, and finally, the last state in the Union voted to disestablish religion, and no longer would citizens have to pay taxes to maintain public worship and have to follow in the breach a state law mandating attendance at Sunday worship. When that happened, And Concord voted for the referendum, but not that many people showed out, and it wasn't a very big majority. When that happened, that opened the floodgates. By 1837, Concord had the Unitarian congregation, the Trinitarian congregation, a Universalist congregation in the making that would have a church meeting house by 1840, 41, plus Methodist and Baptist preachers here. And by 1842, 43, there were Millerites predicting the end of the world. There were spokesmen for the Church of Latter-day Saints starting to show up. And on 1845, the first Catholic Mass was celebrated in Concord. What if we began a book on Concord in 1845 that started not with Henry David Thoreau going to Walden, but the first Catholic Mass in Concord? So religious diversity came to Concord fast. And in that sudden proliferation of religions on offer, Transcendentalist comes to be yet another. And so the question then becomes, why Transcendentalism in the collection of faiths that you could sign up for?
And
I wanted to pause and see if you wanted to.
all right.
Okay,
We'll
so,
make the next step.
Megan had asked me a while back what things reviewers had not noticed in the book or drawn out.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I thought was really clever in the book, but maybe too clever because nobody noticed, is that I argue that Transcendentalism began to gain a hearing in the Unitarian official publication, the Examiner, starting around 1833, 32, 33, 34, just as the Massachusetts religious establishment was on its last legs. Once religion would be, anybody want to get that?
We've gotten the call.
We've got that. We've already gotten a question from a caller. Once Massachusetts made religion a voluntary choice, every church was going to have to attain its support through contributions and not tax revenue. And people could vote with their feet as to where they wanted to go. It seems to me very likely that the earliest clerical reformers in the Unitarian denomination were seeking to address the question, how are we going to deal with a world in which we actually have to win people over and not count on historical prestige and inherited estate trust funds and tax money? And what they say, Frederick Henry Hedge says, George Ripley says, as do others, is something crucial. They say, you know, religion is not any single church or congregation. Religion is not a gospel or a dogma. These change all the time. Many religions differ from one another. Religion isn't to be conducted just within a majestic cathedral. You can worship God on a hillside under the heavens. Everything about religion is subject to change. Change, incessant change, is the condition of life. The only thing that's permanent in religion, and Theodore Parker will say this clearly, is the religious sentiment that Emerson talked about, the spirit of divinity that runs through everyone, that makes each of us part and parcel of the larger soul in life. So that the Transcendentalism was offering an answer to a world of conflict in religion, that it would bring unity because everyone would join with the universal soul and simultaneously, and this is the other key thing, realize their uniqueness at the very moment they're also realizing everything they have in common with everyone. Because each of us as a part and parcel of the divine soul is a distinctive part and parcel if we can make contact with that within us that is our deepest self to realize. Now, sometimes Transcendentalists came to believe that their deepest self inside would actually lead to a loss of self, that they would become utterly part of the universal.
Mhm.
But for most people, I think the Transcendentalists were offering a religion that was secular and religious simultaneously.
All right. We'll take it, or some of us will anyhow. So, because, the women I've written about didn't land in Concord for lengths of time until later, or if at all. And that, so you don't have Margaret Fuller, you don't have the Peabodys as significant characters in this book. But there are really powerful women, the women of the Thoreau family, the women of the Female Anti-Slavery Society, and in a certain way it's the women who make this the community study rather than the dual biography. And maybe you can say a little bit about the excitement of drawing out those stories.
Yeah, that's great. So first, Margaret Fuller, sojourns in Concord, and I could have dealt with her more than I did. I should tell you all that I cut 150,000 words from the book, and I'm willing to sell outtakes to anyone who wants to bid. This will be a major item in the next Thoreau Society auction. So I could have done more with Fuller in terms of her sojourns in Concord. But the problem is that had I admitted more characters from outside the town, then the notion that this was a community study would have been really undone. Because then you would have had to say, well, why don't you just do a study of the Boston area and place people? And maybe I should have, but by this time I was too locked in. So a couple things. If religion is at the core of this study, then women are at the center. In the 18th century, not just in Concord, but all over Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut, the vast majority of people who joined Congregationalist churches in full communion were women, something like 70 to 75%. And there's not a big difference between strongly Calvinist churches and liberal churches that will someday become Unitarian. Maybe there's a little higher percent, 75, even 80% of the liberal congregations that are female in their full membership. So a story of religion is not just a story of Ezra Ripley, but of the women who sit in the pews. And I tried to give them Mary Moody Emerson and Mary Merrick before she's Mary Merrick Brooks. I try to give a sense of what they're hearing and what they're responding to. Mary Brooks might be, for this purpose tonight, the one to single out because she is, as a young woman in her teens, a young woman who hears Ezra Ripley's sermons and essentially absorbs them. We live in a world of sorrow and suffering. Her mother has died when she was young, when Mary's a young girl. She's now got a stepmother she's not too keen on. And she, is in grief for the mother she's lost and accepts simultaneously that we live in a world of pain. This we have to accept. But as a young woman, she's also saying, I love nothing more than a walk in nature on the moonlight by the river. She's got an early love of nature and romanticism. And she's bookish. She's reading Sir Walter Scott in the early 1820s and other novels. So she's an intellectual, striving woman within a framework of religion that says, live with straightened expectations and do what you can to serve the community. And in this case, not because you're a woman, but because, as Ripley emphasizes, everyone has an obligation to foster the common good. So now, jump ahead. Mary Merrick Brooks, after she marries the lawyer Nathan Brooks, will become a key figure in the Concord Female Charitable Society, which is founded in 1814. And my account of this, I was kind of pleased with because I asked the question, not just when were they formed and what was their mission statement and who were members, but why 1814? And was there a great upsurge in poverty that led to the women in Concord forming a group to assist needy women and their children and help them get schooling. Well, in fact, there was no great increase in poverty. And when I kept trying to figure out, well, why and how, was this a forerunner of female charitable societies, or was it a latecomer or whatever? What I discovered is essentially the best answer is Concord was early in starting such groups. And they were started because women wanted to act in society in their own right. It was an exercise of female initiative, and there never would be a shortage of poor, needy people to help. But the real explanation is a stirring of an initiative that will become an agency through which women do a lot. They write a constitution, they have public annual meetings, they gather funds for one another, they have auctions, they even loan money to businessmen in town at interest. And from that experience, we'll see that Mary Merrick Brooks go on to found the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. And when they do so, remarkably, a very high percentage of the founding members of the Anti-Slavery Society are members of the Charitable Society, unlike many other female anti-slavery societies that have been studied.
Interesting. So just a couple more questions and then we'll get some questions from the audience. So start thinking of your questions. You have said, or I heard you say in an interview with someone else.
I was cheating.
That you had, as a young man, a passion for Walden. And that was one reason that Concord appealed to you to write about initially, even though first you wrote about the Revolutionary era. But in this book, you kind of end before Walden almost. And are there things you would have wanted to say about Walden that were part of what you cut out? Or are you sad you didn't get to say more about Walden? Would you?
Well, yeah, but I remember the last chapter deals with Walden and the manuscript with which Thoreau came out of Walden.
Yes.
And I interpret that. And I talk about the bean field as the case in point. So there were a couple major problems. And that is, first, that if I was to deal with Walden as I had expected, then I had to take the narrative well into the 1850s. And so many things changed that the book would have had to have a different shape altogether. I would have had to talk, Thoreau's educating himself to be a naturalist and a scientist. While Concord was the venue for that self-training, the intellectual tools didn't derive from Concord, but from the wider world. Secondly, the Know-Nothing Party took over in Concord, and I would have had to deal with nativism as a reaction to immigration. Third, I would have had to deal with a really crucial phenomenon, which is that Concord was effectively being eclipsed as an independent town following the coming of the railroad. And when I said earlier that action on anti-slavery, signing those petitions, became dependent upon what the American Anti-Slavery Society did, it would be even more the case when the major scene of action in the 1850s would be in Boston in the fight over the rendition of fugitive slaves. So the carrying of the story, if I wrote it the way I was writing the narrative, would have become impossible.
Yeah.
And the implicit in that is that this is a community study, and the era when Concord was at its peak as an independent community is really from the early to mid 1820s to the Panic of 1837 and shortly thereafter. That's the one time when all these Massachusetts towns in the hinterland, if you will, of Lowell and Waltham at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution are all prospering. And they all are starting to feel like we can ride the tides of change. We're controlling our independent lives. And when the panic comes and the prolonged depression, they all get a rude awakening, as we did in 2007. And so I now realize, and if you all want to cheer me on, we'll see if I do this. The story in part one of the book is the story of a social order and how it came apart. And I realized that I could really give a picture of a society and community that I don't think any historian's ever done. And I wanted to do that and how it came apart.
Mhm.
Now that it's done, I could footnote what I said. The book, if I did it again and could footnote what I'd already written, would start in 1834 when Emerson moved to Concord. And it would then end with the Civil War.
Mhm.
And it would then be a narrative that would be much more about transcendental, perhaps, than the townsman
Mhm. Well,
itself.
start again. That's
Um,
the only choice. So, last question. I know that you had a media event recently that involved some rock group or something like that, and or some relation to a rock group. And over the weekend, the Globe had an editorial comparing Emerson and Taylor Swift. So I wonder, is there a rock band or a popular musician that you think really, embodies the transcendentalist spirit? If you had to choose one?
Well, she should, just so you won't all wonder, it was not the Rolling Stones. It was U2, the Irish rock group, has a station on Sirius Radio. And I was just interviewed by someone named John Kelly, who does a program on Sunday mornings called Elevation. And he interviewed me, and it was a beautiful day. Of lyrics which have been interpreted on the web as transcendentalists. I think maybe I would go with Joni Mitchell.
All right. Joni Mitchell. Okay, well, a little applause and we'll have some more questions. Yeah, okay. Okay. Oh, you'll take questions. Okay, you can field the questions, right? And either of us will take, any of us will take questions.
We'll take that from the audience, and if I can ask one of you to repeat the questions. to the
Sure,
microphone,
yeah.
And if there's a way of getting an online question, let me know. Great. Sure, let me, sure, please.
Go back to why Congress. Why
Oh, we need,
this vortex that drew in all of these spirits, questioning. And we look at it in terms of death, death afraid of me. We go through vortexes, there's the power to get afraid of fear. And as we open to
so this is more a comment than a question about a kind of magnetic force of Concord, or a vortex that draws us here. And maybe, do you feel that too? Is there something
I wish the vortex
supernatural almost?
had helped me finish sooner.
But thank you. I think there has to be something. There has to be something. It's in the air or the water, or
Okay.
except of course we know that Nathaniel Hawthorne was not too happy in Concord, and he considered
No,
the river sluggish and it was too hot and he always had to leave. So I don't know, it didn't work on everyone.
well, in fact, the majority of people born here left. And so, and seem to have had reasonably contented lives thereafter. On the other hand, it's surprising the number of people who moved to the West, especially men, after the 1840s or 50s, who died and their bodies were sent back to be buried in Sleepy Hollow. One very good example is George Washington Wright, who grew up on a farm in Concord and then became a merchant because he married the daughter of a wealthy merchant. I guess he was a newspaper man too, lived in Nantucket, and his father-in-law sent him out to San Francisco around the time of the gold rush. And he did very well, but most remarkably, the very first congressman from California after state's admission in 1850 was George Washington Wright, who served one term and then moved back to the East, died and is buried in Sleepy Hollow. So the vortex got him.
Barry, then we'll move back.
Well, just 3 comments and a question. I think it is very close to a biography as Ripley. I think he's a major character in that book. And you learn an awful lot about his influence. And as far as certainly Henry David Thoreau religious inclinations are concerned, I think he learned something about his mother's defection from going over to the Congregation Society on the basis, I would say, of private judgment. And that was kind of key to the Unitarians moving away from churches of the standing order, was on that basis. And then, kind of incidentally, not that they might have known much about it, but there was a Dedder decision that said that it was the parish of the church, not the members.
Right.
And I think that was kind of a key thing. Now, my rhetorical question, Aldous Huxley wrote a wonderful essay called Wordsworth in the Tropics. So how would, Wordsworth's version of romanticism differ from being portrayed in poetry if he had in fact had been the Amazon instead of, the lake country of England. And you could say the same thing about Emerson and Thoreau. Thoreau talks so much about wildness, but the kind of wildness he experienced was pretty tame compared to the wildness, say, of the Amazon or even the swamps in Florida. I don't know that there's an answer to that, but I think it's something worth thinking about since that's so key to Thoreau's romantic imagination of the wild.
I'm going to summarize a little bit, because is it the case that probably most of what he said was not heard by the, okay. So we got 3 comments that the biography, the book is so much a wonderful, portrait of Ezra Ripley, almost a biography, that Thoreau's took a great lesson from his mother's sense of private judgment, or what he considered her private judgment in removing herself from the established church, and the Dedham decision, which said the parish owned the church, not the members. Did I get that right? But the question has to do with an Aldous Huxley essay, Wordsworth in the Tropics. So if the Transcendentalists were in the tropics rather than Concord, would it have gone differently? Did it have to be a pond in New England?
Well, first, thank you for those comments. I think the book is actually a triple biography, if you will, of Ezra Ripley, Emerson, and Thoreau. And I think your comments draw on what I've said and are well taken. Sarah Hoare, the wife of Samuel Hoare, the congressman and so-called squire of Concord, said once that Henry talks about nature as if she was born and bred in Concord. Emerson resisted Margaret Fuller's injunction to him that he really ought to get out of Concord where nature was too tame and go somewhere where he could really be tested.
Mhm.
Both, I think she meant by people who might blow strong and hard against him, as well as the winds and mountains that would challenge him as well. He said Concord had exactly what he wanted: hills that weren't too high to climb, roads that could take you easily to any part of town, or he could walk and he could hike to Walden. And I think that while Wordsworth is undoubtedly correct, I think in the tropics with mosquitoes and disease, it would be hard perhaps to celebrate nature as readily. And yet, I think that Thoreau's point is wildness is wherever you look. It can be in your own backyard. See the raccoon on your garbage can and you're not looking at your friendly dog.
Mhm.
You know, we're looking at things that are other to us. And it is important, I think, that Thoreau is not writing about, in Walden, a wild west, but a nature that's simultaneously accessible, yet whose otherness needs to be respected and preserved.
Great, thank you. Question in the back and a question online. So, yeah, please. I have a hard time seeing the lights, but it's right on.
Were you able to determine, was Thoreau right that the Concordians was wise and quite dispersed?
We have to repeat the
Yes, I'm
question.
going to repeat it. The question is, was Thoreau right? Did the Concordians lead lives of quiet desperation? That is a terrific question. No, I think I would argue that I show in the book that most people did not act like there was no choice left. That one of the things that makes Thoreau's comment so astonishing is that any history of the North in the first half of the 19th century by a historian who's good anytime in the last 50 years would emphasize the growth of individualism, the multiplicity of choices, the proliferation of places to which people were moving, that in one way after another, people were asserting themselves, whether as Whigs or as Democrats or as anti-Masons. So in fact, I would say Thoreau is picking up on a development of his time, seeing it in extremes and bewailing the extent that everybody doesn't go with him to follow that. There's a book by the historian Robert Wiebe that in fact emphasizes at the core of his account of Jacksonian America, the multiplicity of choices. Now, we can suggest, if we want to sympathize with Thoreau, that many of the choices are too limited, they're false. They involve unholy and unnecessary compromises. There are things that he would urge us to do that we don't do. Bronson Alcott would say, you celebrate the Industrial Revolution and the growing comfort. You're all wearing cotton shirts while you do so. Get rid of those cotton shirts and boycott cotton and bring an end to slavery. That might be true, but I haven't seen anybody I know give up their laptop despite the rare earth minerals to help those laptops run and the exploitation in the world that brings them to you. So we're not very different from the people we write about and look at and often condemn without realizing we're like them. So in one sense, perhaps, when we lead our lives by conceding to the forces that control us, we live with quiet desperation. The Supreme Court, I would suggest, would like us all to be living in quiet desperation, and we need not to.
Question from online, and that is, what impact did Emerson's financial position have on the course of the Transcendentalist movement?
We need to repeat
If you
that
could,
line.
please.
Yes. So the question from online is, what impact did Emerson's financial situation have on the course of the Transcendentalist movement?
If we could go back in time, we could suggest to Emerson that he needed to take that large estate that he inherited from Ellen Tucker and create the Concord Foundation for the Humanities. And then he could have supported young men and especially young women as they came of age to do something with their education. Emerson did help Bronson Alcott a lot financially. And so to the extent that you're delighted at Bronson Alcott's writings, or even more delighted that Louisa May Alcott didn't starve to death in her childhood and went on to write. So he certainly supported the Alcotts. He provided jobs and he thought editorial opportunities for Thoreau. It's possible he helped others in ways that we don't know, though his account books, which Joel Meyerson was finishing the editing before Joel died this past year, would show if he had done that. And I didn't see, and he gave me transcripts some years ago. I never saw Emerson giving out his money for that purpose. Nor did I actually see, and for most of the time, Emerson giving funds to the New England and then the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. So he did pledge a substantial amount of money for the Free Kansas Committee.
Well, where would Thoreau have built his cabin?
Right.
That's maybe the root of this question from the ether here. Thank you for the question. Any more audience questions?
So on one hand, you've got the transcendentalists all kind of making a beeline to Concord, or people who thought they were transcendental. On the other hand, you have people like Hawthorne, who's convinced that Concord is infested by these strange oddballs who are here following Emerson and Thoreau. What did the vast majority of Concordians think of all of these people kind of coming to Concord and making their pilgrimage to Emerson's house?
Well, there's testimony of a good number of people. The question is, what did the most people in Concord think of all the oddballs and eccentrics and weirdos coming into Concord and making a beeline for Emerson's house? They did not, unlike contemporary oddballs, stick around to ask if you have any spare change on the streets of Concord. But I think the answer to that is a lot of people would say, I never understood Emerson, couldn't figure out a word he was saying. Some people didn't like Emerson's endorsement eventually of the temperance movement. And there's an anecdote that there was a kind of effigy of Emerson hung from one of the bars for a while. But he was not a big temperance reformer. I think that there were people who admired Emerson because he gave for free in Concord most of the lectures for which he charged elsewhere. And so he was respected for his neighborliness and community mindedness in making that gesture. This grows out as like he joined the Concord Lyceum, and the Lyceum members were all expected to give lectures to one another or participate in debates. So people saw him as a generous person. The elite of the town, this was the thing I found most remarkable. The elite of the town, the leading businessmen and lawyers, doctors, ministers, formed a group called the Social Circle. And it was limited to 25 members at a time. And not too long after Emerson moved into town by 1837, he was nominated for membership and elected when the slot opened in 1840. That's quite remarkable, given that in Boston, the counterparts to the Concord elite were denouncing Emerson for Nature in the Boston Daily Advertiser, and then for the American Scholar, and especially for the infidelity, the latest form of it, in the Divinity School address. So the Boston elite and Cambridge professors were all saying, Emerson, he's not reliable, he's a danger. He might even be like the atheist Abner Neeland, denying all Christian revelation. And there they are in Concord electing him, maybe because they knew that with an estate of $13,000 from the late wife, he could be trusted. It is really an astounding fact that by 1840, Emerson's lecturing in the Masonic Temple in Boston, giving lectures to George Bancroft, the intellectual who's a major leader in the Massachusetts Democratic Party, are elated by, and they say, he's about to come out and be a radical Democrat. We're sure he will. We're just waiting for him to take that. And yet, no one's upset in Concord. So we might say, to go back to Richard's question, maybe there was a surprising degree of tolerance in the town for people who might have all kinds of views that outraged their neighbors, but were decent neighbors, and that neighborliness mattered most of all as a value.
Here, then we'll go online.
The rest of direction this young man who goes to the beginning. Did they attend the Concord Lyceum? Or did they attend the churches or both?
So
Well-
the question is, what became of the restless young men in the back pews of the churches? Did they attend the Lyceum? Did they come to Emerson's lectures? What do we know?
And I'm
they-
really glad you asked that because first of all, the young men in the back of the pews weren't there. So Ezra Ripley was
Oh.
having a lot of trouble getting the young.
Yeah,
And so the Lyceum movement began as an effort to draw young men, mechanics, merchants, clerks, and like into the study of science and technology so that they could collaborate with their bosses in advancing the Industrial Revolution. That's how the movement for the diffusion of useful knowledge began in England, and its counterparts, the Lyceum movement, took off in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Very quickly in New England, the Lyceums became more organizations for communities. But at the heart of their message was that the Lyceum would provide young men in cities, clerks far from home and parents to guide them, mechanics the same way, and provide them something to do to improve themselves instead of haunting taverns and carousing on the street. So the Lyceum and the debating clubs, some young men's libraries were all measured to take the young men who were not joining the Masonic lodges, which would be another way to control them, and weren't joining the churches, liberal or unitarian or evangelical. But we can get them to organize and straighten out their lives in the Lyceum movement. And they did get a lot, though a number of Lyceums, especially in the big cities, could themselves become raucous settings where young men would disrupt them. And like one of the things we often forget, this was something I was kind of pleased with in the book, is we often write semi-solemn and nostalgic and admiring accounts of all the self-improving Yankees who went to the Lyceum to hear these great lectures and cared about culture and learning. Well, the Lyceums, especially in the cities, had to get audiences. What were they competing with? They were competing with other lecture series. They were with hypnotists, with phrenologists. In Concord itself, Nehemiah Ball, I described, giving a lecture in which he's talking about the wild animals of the world. And he actually has an early projector on his screen, a magic lantern, showing you, he would say, "This is a lion, I presume. This is a fierce animal." And John Shepherd Kice remembers that the boys were in the back of the lecture laughing wildly at how stupid Nehemiah Ball sounded, especially since you could go to, if you turn now at the Mill Dam and you make your left turn to go to this Masonic Lodge, you will be standing on a spot where there were in the 1820s and 30s and 40s traveling zoos in Concord, where you could see camels and lions. So why go to the Lyceum? Hear Nehemiah Ball drone on about the wild animals when you can actually see wild animals. So the Lyceum had to compete for people, just as Ezra Ripley had to compete with the Trinitarians and the Universalists for people to come to his meeting house. So the Lyceum would have to compete with concerts. When Emerson announced his first series of his own in Boston at the Masonic Temple, I have a section in the book in which I describe, if you wanted to skip Emerson, what plays could you go to in Boston? And Tyrone Power, the aunt's forebear of the actor, some of you may be as old as I to remember, Tyrone Power was opening in a play about an Irish girl on Tremont Street in Boston.
Maybe a question online, then we can come back to.
and there's someone in the back there to keep an eye on with a
Well,
question.
give
Yeah.
me online people.
Yeah, yes, right.
It's a nice question. So speaking of the eccentrics, how do we understand Emerson's persistent support, financial and emotional, of the irresponsible ne'er-do-well, Ellery Channing?
Can you explain Emerson's support of this person describes Ellery Channing, the poet, as the irresponsible ne'er-do-well, which I guess being a Fuller family advocate, I probably agree with that description.
And I believe that the 1850 or census or otherwise 1860 census listing Ellery Channing's occupation listed as ne'er-do-well. It's just true.
Really?
Yeah,
All right, okay.
exactly.
So he was,
He was widely recognized. Everybody needs a title. He got one. I guess I don't know enough to answer that question.
well, he admired the poems
Mhm.
and he helped get the poems published, right? Were the poems published?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, well, he was trying to sort of help out Ellery and Ellen keep their marriage together.
Sure.
He was, yeah, I don't know. I mean, he supported a number of odd
I think-
things, but
So what I would want to do to answer that question is not answer it in general, but try to identify the moments when he actually made the contribution.
yeah,
And then figure out what in the marriage or what in Channing's life struck Emerson then as opposed to all the other times he could have given him money.
mhm.
Towns and also people with concrete use of their parts. The word isn't, it isn't Ipswich or London or a variation of the old P. It's not a water town or green field reflection of nature. Concord has four meanings. It means peace, as we know. Concord means with the heart. Concord means covenant. A native daughter of the common said it also means to follow nature. So the whole is in part, the stories in the title, in the very name, you have something quite evocative. The other thing I wanted to say, again, to those who mentioned slowly from their hearts, there's been kind of a relay race passing in the church. Again, as we heard earlier, praying meetings. Established the first non-native Indian images called the outpost settlement, first step in rural the crucible of the American Revolution. Some of the most prophetic voices ever since. Some of our founding social scientists. Harrison Dwyer, on the telephone line, or Edison. We go on in the 60s with the Concord prison didn't blow up as many other prisons in the country because of the shared leadership program. Like according to Beth Smith, who was very well aware of this. Al Ehrenfried in Trinity Episcopal Church also distinguished the church in terms of addressing trauma among the youth. Lastly, surgeon incredible National Geographic wrote their first article, on computers. 2, if not 3, of the 4 individuals were highlighted locally for the conference. So there is something that just along those of us who didn't talk with those with the conference and parts can carry on. Unfortunately, it has. If we hold ourselves on the right meetings such as this and all of our work, and unfortunately go on generations to come.
Thank you.
I,
Is there any way you can summarize that a bit for those?
yes,
who couldn't hear?
our speaker will be elected as the chair of the Board of Selectmen in the next election in Concord. He suggested that Concord is in our heart, and he emphasized that the word Concord means harmony, unity, covenant, and that ideal, I think, together with perhaps a commitment to knowledge, to discovery, to individuality, has inspired many moments in Concord's history in many individuals. You can get me going on this too, but I would say, and Mike Frederick and I have a ongoing conversation about this. He's a lumper, I'm a splitter. And I would, as a historian, start to say, were those people in the National Geographic piece about computers, were they actually born in Concord or not? Did they go away to college and university, and was their training elsewhere? Do we falsely claim people who are from someplace larger? But I will say the crucial thing that I agree with the questioner is that, and this is a theme in the book, that a great many people in Concord developed in the early 19th century and building on the revolutionary and Puritan heritage and passed on to their descendants a civic identity that emphasizes the interdependence of people in this community on the commitment to a larger good. And that civic culture is in fact part of what I try to describe in the book. Because what I just portray is an individualism that simultaneously reflects all the ways that people are pulling apart from one another in the first couple of decades of the 19th century. And yet in Emerson and Thoreau, nonetheless, still serve to inspire a commitment to a larger community. And that commitment to the community, the lights I see just went out, the commitment to community is really crucial, as I view it, to a New England heritage that does make this region distinctive from other parts of the country. How did Rock Rib Republican towns become blue from red? I think it has much to do with a continuing sense of connection to one another. And that's a connection that we ought to prize, that matters a great deal, even as we failed in numerous ways. One reason I wouldn't just endorse the notion we've all been conquered, that has failed to embrace all people or provided opportunity to everyone. So, but an ideal of inclusion and interdependence is deeply rooted in the town's history, even as a reality of racism and slavery and oppression of Native peoples and harsh treatment of a good many.
We have time for a few more questions. There was one in the back there.
Not so much a question, but a comment. I don't think Emerson ever paid anything to Elder Channing. What he did was a minor amount. And the reason was, Elder Channing's father was the dean of the medical school of Harvard University. His mother, Barbara Perkins, was one of the wealthiest families in Massachusetts. They certainly didn't have to rely on Emerson for anything. I just want to clear that up. And the second point about you being near the well, my research shows he's the only transcendentalist with a sense of humor. That census, someone asked, so what do you do? He could have said I'm a professional poet, because that's what he claimed to be. But instead he said, I'm a near the well. And I don't know if you asked him to see that day, what would he have responded? I'm a typical lawyer. He was told by people in Concord. I'm just defending, forgetting my defense.
Okay, we heard an excellent defense of Ellery the poet as the transcendentalist with the best sense of humor.
And non-panhandler.
I guess maybe that is a question. Did the transcendentalists have a sense of humor? I was a good friend of Justin Kaplan, who wrote biographies of Mark Twain and Walt Whitman. And he said he felt the transcendentalists had no sense of humor. I don't know. I know they thought they had a sense of humor, but and maybe Ellery was the only one with it.
Emerson gave a lecture comedy that has no wit or humor in it.
Rich, do you have a comment about humor, maybe, in response to that? Oh, okay.
Sure. Please.
The group, pretty that they were repelled world.
So. Well, I was drawing there on Emerson, both in the American Scholar and in the Transcendentalists. Here in the American Scholar, he clearly means college-educated young men or academy-educated young men, where he says they're essentially alienated by the way in which the business of our time is conducted, at the corruption, at the lies that you have. If in Emerson's larger view, trade is often little more than deceit and theft. Think of merchants going into Cuba, lying and saying they're Catholic and engaging in the slave trade. Thoreau, and so in Emerson's view, seeking to speak for young people, many of them thought that they wanted to live in a world that would be true to their principles. But what if you went to public office? You'll be subject now to the demands of political parties and patronage machines and running for office and spouting the lies of your party. So he saw young men not wanting to enter a world that would, in a sense, debase them, make them feel something lesser, that they would have to go along with what their parents wanted, so to conform and live out their parents' lives. Or some of them, many of them, would hold back, Emerson says, this is an American Scholar address, and wait or fall into despair, some of them suicides, he says in the American Scholar. In the Transcendentalists, he's talking about people who in effect, they're on strike. They're striking work, he says, waiting for something worthwhile to do. So I don't know how big or small that group is. I sure can tell you that in my teaching career, students responded deeply to those lines in Emerson and Thoreau, whether it was at Amherst College or William and Mary or the University of Connecticut or Brown. Those lines spoke then. So Emerson sees a generation of young people, maybe we can say the sons and daughters of people who are really beginning to prosper in the Industrial Revolution, who have come of age with independence. And now these children want something more than what their parents had that would really fulfill them. Emerson wants to be their spokesman. Barzillai Frost, the minister of Concord, read Emerson's lecture, The Transcendentalists, when it's published, and he gives a lecture before the Lyceum in Concord, and he says, I've just read that a distinguished clergyman defends young people for striking work and saying there's nothing worthy of their talents to do. Don't we have enough poverty? Don't we have causes, people drunk in the gutter who need to be helped? Don't we have lots of work for them to do, not to indulge their own dissatisfactions, but to serve the community? That was in Concord, the central conflict. Were you going to live up to your obligations as a member of an interdependent community, or were you going to go off on your own, insist on your own truth? Emerson and Thoreau struggled, and I think in some ways successfully, to find a way to both live for their own truths and serve the community.
Thank
Do
you.
you have any more questions?
I have one more question online.
Yeah,
Maybe
okay.
time for one more from
Okay.
the audience if we have time, but thank you. It's been a wonderful session. So someone writing in from Needham, asking about the Dedham decision and touching on the religious controversy and strike. And apparently in the Needham-Dedham area, ended with people burning down a church as they left it. So it got quite fraught. How did this play out among our Transcendentalist friends as well as general populace? Did it have lasting impact? Did people resolve? How did it play out as time went by?
So this is a question about the Dedham decision in 1820. And essentially from the early 1880s, 10s on, more and more Congregationalist churches in Massachusetts were splitting as the Orthodox were tired of what they saw as the liberal, empty, stale preaching of the soon-to-be Unitarians. And when they split, the Congregationalists said, we're really true to the heritage of the Puritans, and we ought to inherit the historic meeting house and the trust funds and the communion silver, and let the Unitarians go off on their own. Well, there were lawsuits. Sometimes the members of the society, which is of the town, might have supported the liberal preaching, but the Orthodox, many of whom were church members, wanted to go off on their own. And what happened was the courts decided that it was the society in the town that owned the building and the trust funds and the like. So the Trinitarian congregation in Concord had to split off on its own and was suddenly really poor and didn't have the inherited income. And as a result, in their mind, the Trinitarians, while they were upholding the historic banner of Peter Buckley, the founding minister of Concord, they saw themselves as oppressed, cheated out of the historic funds. Unitarian lawyers led by Samuel Hoare of Concord had won the day and got the communion silver and got the church bell, and they were stuck on their own. And they were by early 1840s. The Trinitarian congregation was appealing to the general Trinitarian Charity Foundation to help support the Concord Church. They had incredible turnover of members. Nobody stayed for very long. There were all kinds of fighting among the members. And meanwhile, Ezra Ripley's congregation and then Barzillai Cross was losing ever more members, but still supporting itself with the inherited fund.
Well, Rochelle maybe should have a question because, yeah.
What are two or so ways in which you book influences understandings of Thoreau?
What the question is, what are 2 or 3 ways that I see in the book how Thoreau was influenced by the change in the world around?
How does it help people understand Thoreau?
Yeah, a couple of
Ways.
ways. You hope your book alters or segments of understandings of Thoreau.
Okay, first, that Thoreau was deeply involved with the community and was caught up in all its many ties of interdependence, even as he sought to go his own way. I say in the book that no matter when he was alone, he always brought the town with him. He also saw himself as much a Concord patriot as the earlier commentator, a Concord patriot to whom he paid his most fervent statements of loyalty to the town when he wasn't there. Whenever he's back, he's full of criticism, but whenever he's away, he knows how much he misses it. He's in a kind of love relationship. And it lasted. So secondly, he is very much a son of Concord. Look at the opening chapter, Economy. It's a Lyceum lecture in which he berates the neighbors in one way after another, in ways that my students are always insulted by. But I think the audience in the Lyceum said, yep, another Lyceum lecture in which they criticize us. So he was, and in many ways, I think crucially, Thoreau's thinking is often an extreme mode of the thinking of his neighbors. A key moment in the book, I think, is when I give a new account of Thoreau as a school teacher, in which I show that his resigning as village grammar school master was an odd thing to do because Nehemiah Ball, the boring lecturer, but also school committeeman, had said, you really have to keep tougher discipline in the school. People have thought that the school committee was made up of a bunch of old-fashioned corporal punishment, get those kids to sit quietly and recite their lessons type. In fact, the school committee was in the front ranks of school reform. And it's a mystery of why Thoreau didn't offer a riposte and go to the school committee and say, I want to do something new. They would have accepted it. So Thoreau, I guess what I would say is, and if the book had been longer and in the way that Megan had asked, I would have shown even more how fully Thoreau was immersed in the culture of reform of the town. He deserves to be remembered as the man of Concord, as Emerson called him, because his activities played out the ideas and values of his neighbors in a way that none of us will ever forget. And he takes Ezra Ripley's ideology of interdependence, broadens it, and in his relation to the natural world, comes to see human beings bound up in interdependence with nature And it is, I will now say in tribute to our earlier commentator, is the heritage of Concord and Ezra Ripley's ideal of interdependence that filtered through the transcendentalist individualism of Emerson and Thoreau, give you ecology and environmentalism thereafter.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you both, Bob and Megan, for
Yeah. Thank you all. I'll be happy to sign your books if you brought them today, or if you meet me on the streets of Concord, or on Saturday evening at the book signing here. But if any of you want me to do it now and not wait, I'll be happy to sit here and wait for you.
thank you again. That was tremendous.
I think Thoreau was very funny.
Yes.
His story about the farming.
I think I
was actually me.